Hey everyone, this is Brandon Rush. Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Agent Investor. The goal of The Agent Investor is to help our audience make informed decisions in terms of their investments and property through conversations with those affiliated in the commercial and multifamily space. Today, I have a good and new friend of mine, Tim Myjak. Tim is a licensed environmental professional here in Connecticut, and we're going to talk a little bit about, multifamily ownership, multifamily renovations, commercial renovations, things along those lines, and how that pertains to environmental hazards and just environmental in general, what considerations we need to take, things along those lines. So I'm going to let Tim talk for a little bit. So Tim, how's it going today?
Great. Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So we'll kick it off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you're affiliated with the commercial multifamily space.
Sure. My name is Tim Myjak. As mentioned, I'm a licensed environmental professional here in the state of Connecticut. I'm also a licensed Connecticut asbestos inspector and management planner. I work for an environmental consulting firm called EKI Environment and Water. Our local office is based right here in Glastonbury, but we have offices from here to California. I've been doing this work for about 30 years, and I'm a graduate of UPenn.
Very good. Easy, man. You're good. All right, so we'll get right to it. From your experience, what are some of the more common environmental hazards that multifamily properties should be aware of, or owners should be aware of when they're considering or planning renovations on their properties?
Well, the same hazards that have been here for probably 20 or 30 years are still here. The same regulations that regulate, these type of properties and renovations, demolitions, and the purchase of them have been here. What we do is often regulated by EPA, regulated by OSHA for work that's being done in these type of homes. They could be Connecticut DPH regulated, HUD regulated, Connecticut DEP regulated, and also regulated by local health departments and municipalities. In addition to that, there could be requirements on properties like this from both financial institutions, banks that might be financing it, that might go above and beyond something with a request, and even insurance companies. So all that comes into play with what we do for environmental due diligence and building hazard management in multifamily properties here in Connecticut. It is important, especially if you're buying a property, to start with proper due diligence. Due diligence could be, for example, understanding, was a property always a residential structure? Was it built on an old former factory, for example? A property that might be more, for example, in the inner city, years ago, multifamily properties had storefronts. Was that storefront a dry cleaner, for example? I've got many of those type of sites that I'm working on, for example, in Waterbury or New Britain, something like that, because those type of sites, they could be all residential now, but they could have a significant environmental impact. So doing due diligence is very important. Sometimes it's just that I had that large garage on the property where a tenant or a former owner did some type of other operation or servicing that could cause an environmental liability, releases of chemicals or petroleum products to the ground. And in some of those cases, those, under the current regulations, and I'll talk a little bit later about proposed regulations, those sites are regulated. You might have to notify the state of Connecticut when you're buying and selling those properties. A buyer or seller might need to commit to investigating and cleaning up a spill or release under the current and new proposed regulations. Other areas of due diligence for these type of properties, there's always the underground storage tanks and above ground storage tanks. Properties are on natural gas now. That's great. But you go in the basement and you see the copper lines, you see the former fill and vent pipes. Was there a 2,000 gallon underground storage tank out next to the house that could have caused a release, a spill? That could be a potential liability that you could have to deal with on a property like this. Wells and septic systems. If you have a property that has the potential to service 25 individuals on a daily basis for more than 60 days a year, you could, and if you have a well on the property, you have to be registered like non-transient potable water supply with the Department of Public Health and have to have certain types of treatment. Inner cities, you're probably going to be on municipal water and sewer systems, but once you branch out from typically those I-91, 95 corridors, a lot of Connecticut doesn't have municipal water supplies, doesn't have municipal sewer supplies. So understanding what you have on your property, understanding the age of it, the condition of it, and the water quality, for example. Well testing that's done by a typical building inspector, test for hardness, test for iron, they don't test for chemicals that could have been associated with the gasoline station down the street.
Mm.
And those are the kind of things where if you have tenants in the building and you're providing that water supply from a well, you could potentially be liable for. And then we've got the renovations. We've got the old asbestos and the lead and the
Yeah.
PCB building caulks. With asbestos, if it's not glass, metal, or wood, you need to identify whether it's asbestos or not if you're renovating it,
Mm.
handling it, disrupting it. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily abate it and dispose of it, but you can't cause a fiber release. You have to handle these things properly. You have to dispose of them properly. Lead, for example, it must be now at least 10 or 15 years ago, there's a lead paint contractor certification. Your contractors, your subcontractors need to be certified to do painting. They basically do it.
Really?
They basically do it. They assume, you could go out and test, or you just assume that it's going to have lead-based paint in it. And you manage your operations, your renovations, your painting, your scraping in a manner that if it was lead, it's not going to cause a problem. With some of the commercial properties and the residential multifamilies, there are HUD disclosure requirements that there could be lead paint, or if there is lead paint, how it's being managed. And this is all to protect typically with the lead young children.
Yeah.
And then PCBs. PCBs are used in paints and caulks in residential settings, and there's ways to manage that. And that
What
material
are what are PCBs?
polychlorinated biphenyls. They were man-made compounds that were added to things to make them better. And it's another chemical that's found in products that could cause potential, I would say, financial liability, because if it's there, can it be managed in place? Or if you disrupt it, like asbestos or like lead paint, you might have to disrupt it, manage it in a certain way, and dispose of it. So those are the same things that we've been dealing with, in my 30 plus years of my career, are still here. Asbestos products, again, if it's not glass, metal, or wood, you need, if you're doing a renovation or demolition permit, most towns require you to have an inspection done prior to that.
Got it. So my question is, just thinking about the type of investors I work with small, medium, and large investors or owners of property. Let's talk about acquisition. How would they determine this need for this environmental? Say, example, someone's going out to buy a 20-unit residential building. It's mostly 95% occupied, your normal run-of-the-mill building. How does that process look for them to have the building checked in terms of its environmental to make sure that it's not protected, but it's in a good position to purchase from the environmental standpoint?
Yeah, so the types of inspections that environmental professionals, building inspectors, licensed lead inspectors do could be done at any time. They could be done when somebody already owns a property and has to do such a renovation or a demolition. But if you're looking at a property, it's best to do it before you purchase it. The inspections, find a good consultant, work with a good consultant, work with a licensed person, get in the loop with some good mitigation contractors that do the asbestos and lead abatement and mitigation. So if you're looking at something, the cost of what you're getting into. It's that spend a little money up front so you don't get caught with your tail between your legs later on when you go in there and try to start your renovation. So to answer your question, when is it good to do it? Well, if you don't own it yet, have somebody that has a good set of eyes, pay to have some sampling done ahead of time so you know exactly what it could potentially cost you. Asbestos abatement, for example, if you've got floor tiles in a kitchen or a bathroom, if they're in good condition, it doesn't require you to do something. But if you're planning to update something and you're gonna rip up that floor, then you probably want to know what it's going to cost you to have somebody that's not your average contractor, if it's going to be asbestos, come in and do it, because these aren't $500, $1,000 mitigations. These could cost tens of thousands of dollars in some of these homes to do your renovations. So know ahead of the game. And just because there's asbestos or just because there's lead paint, don't assume that that's a negotiating chip. A property can be worth what the property's worth, but there always is that potential between a buyer and a seller to negotiate a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there a certain point, not diminishing returns, but is there a point where it's kind of, you just have to eye it? I'm thinking of smaller multifamilies, so say non-commercial multifamily, such as like 3-4 unit properties. Typically those buyers, they're not, unless they're buying a portfolio, they're typically not going out getting environmentals. Do you have any tips for individuals in that space, a lot of them, they also may not be able to afford any more than what they're getting into between their normal inspection. And any recommendations or tips for in the smaller space for those type of investors?
Well, if they're walking through and they're not hiring a contractor, be aware. If you go down into the basement and you see all kinds of old school pipe wraps and you need to replace the boiler, you just be aware that you're probably going to have to deal with some asbestos abatement in addition to the boiler. If you walk through the buildings, a lot of times plasters and sheetrocks had asbestos in it, for example, or could have lead paint on it. It doesn't mean you have to rip it out. But if something is in really deteriorated shape, that's where you might want to raise a red flag and say, hey, I want a second set of eyes on this. Or if I'm spending X on the property, you might want a little bit better contingency in there to cover some of the environmental issues.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it seems like in that space, a lot of the programs I see that are out there, they're not necessarily, like when it comes to asbestos, they're not necessarily removing it. They're more so just encapsulating it, covering it up, or whatever it may be in most cases.
And that's legitimate. There's a lot of different products. There's a lot of different ways to manage these materials in place. There again, the requirement that if a contractor is doing just painting or simple renovations, that they use certain products in these types of homes. It's like that would just be assumed safe to encapsulate paints in place.
Got it. The next question is tied into what we're already talking about in terms of lead and asbestos. In Connecticut, a lot of older buildings, all of them are older buildings for the most part. With these substances, what are some of the potential risks if they're not managed? A lot of people don't, what are some of the risks, that worst case scenarios if they're not done correctly or if they're ignored? Put it that way.
Well, some of the risks, an owner, a contractor that you hire, you hire a contractor if you're not doing it yourself, or if you're doing it yourself, the state health department shows up because stuff winds up in a dumpster. And, the neighbor complains that they see something, and then fines, just physical fines for breaking the law, for not doing the proper inspection and management, the possibility of lawsuits for exposure. But if something is disrupted in a home, or if it's not managed properly, that a tenant could sue you for causing exposure to lead paint, asbestos fibers, things like that. So there's the risks. I had a client that bought a larger complex of residential units, rentals, and they were in, when he bought them, that they were in different stages of renovation. They're, different units in different areas of the complex. And then,
Sure.
He had started to do a little bit more renovation, and it turns out that the prior owner didn't do their due diligence. And I got a call one day, Tim, I need you now. And I kid you not, I showed up on the site. There was the local health department, the state health department, the DEP, the state police, an environmental arm of the FBI standing there waiting for me to walk through the door to figure out what are we going to do to prevent exposure to the units that were already renovated and prevent exposure to people that were going to move into the new units. And we developed a plan. We mitigated fines in that case, but it still cost him several $100,000 of investigation work. Again, very large complex, maybe 130 units, but that's the level of, if it's done wrong and if you get caught, you're dealing with a lot of agencies that have the potential to fine and arrest you, basically.
Wow. I didn't realize it was that significant in terms of the amount of agencies involved. Okay, cool. All right, Tim. So thank you so much for that. We'll jump into the next question. So looking ahead, what environmental challenges and/or opportunities do you foresee becoming more prominent in multifamily and just general commercial real estate in the future?
So, looking ahead to the future, well, the past is still here. It's still going to be with us. These regulations aren't going away, although it's common that lead, asbestos, PCBs, for example, aren't used in products regularly. Believe it or not, some stuff still gets into the United States. And so the future, well, what's current and what's in the past is still here. These regulations aren't going to go away, get used to them, and we got to still work with them. Other things that are happening in the future in the environmental arena that could come to play with some of these multifamily residential homes are a new release-based regulatory approach from the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, Energy and Environmental Protection. There are caveats for requirements for releases that could have happened at residential settings that will require cleanup, will require notification to the state of Connecticut, and there'll be different tiers to do cleanup. But when you put the word cleanup on anything, that's going to cost money. Yeah. So in the past, I would say With environmental spills and releases, these might be more related to underground storage tanks that could be in the ground. In the past, I think the state of Connecticut had a little bit more leniency, although they always could have come in and dictated, thou shalt clean that up. In the future, if there's a spill or release, it'll have to be cleaned up. So,
And when you say if there was a spill or release, you mean anything from past history that was found or discovered?
yeah, if something is discovered during a period of due diligence, or if something happens as a result of something while somebody owns it, and there will be notification requirements to state, and either a licensed environmental professional or then a permitted environmental professional will have to come in and certify that a spill or release was cleaned up. So I do foresee in the near future, probably starting about this time next year, that there will be new regulations for commercial sites plus residential sites here in the state of Connecticut. The cleanup standards will be different. They're a little bit different, commercial versus residential. But as you said, looking ahead, what do you see? Well, there could be more potential liabilities. So doing your due diligence before you own a property is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of getting outside of multifamily, in your experience, what type of asset types are you seeing where you have many more obstacles when it comes to environmentals? Because obviously multifamily, from my eyes, it's, we have the asbestos and lead and maybe some underground oil tanks. I think I've seen environmentally, maybe I had a gas station that had an issue across the street from a multifamily property I sold once, and that came back on the records. But that's the most I've seen. What other issues or what other asset classes are maybe having more challenges than just multifamily?
Oh, well, now you're open Pandora's box when you start and industrial and brownfields. Renovations to commercial and industrial buildings, they're regulated also for the asbestos, the lead, the PCBs. They're also regulated currently if there's been spills or releases, and they'll be regulated differently in the near future under a new release-based regulatory program also. What will be good about the new program is it's going to capture more sites. There's no doubt. This new release-based program from the Connecticut Department of Energy Environmental Protection is going to capture more sites. It's going to require more types of cleanups, but more sites will hopefully get cleaned up and it'll get them financeable. There might be a reality check for some of the properties that are being sold by the sellers, but that's just going to have to come down to a negotiation between buyers and sellers on how they approach it. I think the lending institutions are going to drive a lot more need for investigation and cleanup in the near future, because we're working outside of what's currently called the Current Transfer Act program, which regulated a small group of sites. So many more sites, many more releases will require cleanup in the state of Connecticut on the commercial and industrial areas.
And not to get, this is going a bit off script, but I think it's good since it's kind of a big topic in today's environment, the release base versus what's coming up versus what's currently here. At a very high level, can you just give the audience just a quick, we don't have to go super deep into the details, but like what's currently and what's possibly coming with the release base versus what we currently have in place?
Most importantly is to understand what the process is and where we're at with the process. I mean, we're down to the end. We're down to the finish line. There's a public hearing on October 10th in Deep, up in Hartford, that in the Gina McCarthy room, that you could go and you could listen and provide comments on the draft regulations. The draft regulations came out beginning of this past August, I believe. By October 24th, all public comment needs to be in on these regulations. And then Deep will make some modifications, work with some working groups, and they're going to send it over to the legislative folks to regs review to either approve it or not. So once approved, I think it's going to go back and forth a little bit, but I think Deep's trying to get positioned by, like I said, this time next year to have these regulations in place. More sites, as I said, well, if you're going to buy and sell and own commercial properties, if you're what they call a maintainer of an environmental problem, you owe it to the state of Connecticut essentially to investigate and demonstrate that your site's in compliance with these new standards. In the past, let's say a service garage, maybe a non-gasoline station. Service garage that just did oil changes and might have had oil tanks and lifts that released. Technically, that might not have been a regulated site. If they didn't generate hazardous waste, if it wasn't an auto body shop, there was a small group of sites that were always regulated. And if they weren't, you were kind of in limbo a little bit. It was kind of more between the buyer, the seller, and the bank. In the future, though, when spills or releases are identified, even during the potential due diligence period, that will require notification to the state. That'll require a cleanup plan. Depending on the severity of it, it could even dictate how quick you need to do something. So I think the industry will take a step back for a little bit and be a little shock and awe with these new regulations. But we hope that they're going to be extremely valuable to economic development and the transitions in the very near future, because it'll get everything on a level playing field, essentially, and it'll also bring the state of Connecticut on a level playing field with how other states, for example, Massachusetts, regulate commercial transactions.
Got it. So it sounds like it may be a pain in the butt for a period of time for many property owners, but once we get through it's going to standardize things and make things a bit more fluid in the future versus it being, owners in very different places with their properties and not. Okay. Very good. All right, cool. So we are going to start to wrap this up. So we're through all the business questions and environmental questions. So just kind of getting personal. When you're not saving the world through your environmental, what do you enjoy doing on your personal time?
Well, even when I'm doing the environmental stuff, I consider it fun. I do a lot of outreach, a lot of business development and client service stuff. I'm involved with many chambers. I'm involved with many commercial groups. I also sit on a brownfield land bank, which we have the ability to take title on properties and clean them up. But on a personal note, I'm that guy that likes just being outside, the hiking, the boating, the skiing, things like that. And I'm sitting at home today, but the home office, and I like working on my house here that was built in 1750. So, but that a couple years ago, I'm working through that myself.
Yeah. Got it. No, very good. So how can people find you and or get a hold of you?
Sure. Tim Myjak with EKI Environment and Water. My email is tmyjak, so it's TMYJAK at ekiconsult.com. My mobile number is always best. It's on 24 hours a day, 860-398-0070.
Got it. Oh, perfect. All right. So with that said, we want to wrap this up. Thank you to our audience once again for checking out another episode of The Agent Investor. We wish you all the best in your health and happiness. Tim, thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting you for the first time a couple months back, and now us linking up here. And I hope that I continue to work with you and learn through you and hopefully do business with you in the future. But thank you so much for joining us today. And to our audience, thank you all. We look forward to catch you on the next one. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you.